which is what they've always done in these circumstances, withdrawal of Hollywood content from the market, and it's never been tried since the Whitlam era. So it's not that it's without precedent. I mean, South Korea had a local exhibition quota until the FTA with the US saw it's being wound back. So I think it's inconceivable to talk about regulation in this space, but I do think that there are all sorts of business opportunities, enterprise opportunities for engaging with distributors of commercial distributors of film content around Australian content. And that has to be a dialogue, and it has to also be something that the Australian government would take an interest in, because, as I said, you know, there's enterprise questions here and there are content questions here, and how you engage with them is going to take some fresh thinking, and not just a reversion to regulatory options which have not been considered for more than a generation.
You mentioned briefly that the more immediate impact of the new startups was going to be on the film industry rather than the commercial broadcasters, and you said something about catch-up services. I was just wondering if you could expand on catch-up TV services.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on why you don't think the immediate impact will be on the commercial broadcasters.
Yeah, I was making the point that the kinds of extensions into the broadband space of the broadcasters in Australia has been a relatively smooth one. In fact, it's been a relatively successful one. I mean, 9MSN, the Yahoo 7 services, these are very well-trafficked services. ABC iView has obviously done extremely well as well. But so television, the broadcasters don't see broadband as an immediate threat, I would argue, but the startups, that's why I emphasise the film area, because the opportunities for Australian film, given that it is a very small part, as per previous question, very small part of the standard exhibition landscape. It's also a very small part of the online landscape. How can that change? And there are ways in which Australian content, either through these commercial distributors that I've talked a little bit about today, or through disintermediated kind of strategies of getting the content out direct to a public and through viral marketing, there's lots of opportunity in that space. So I just think that the two areas, although they're often conjoined in a lot of thinking, television and film, they're very, very distinct. They have very, very distinct prospects at this point in time.
Yes?
You mentioned that you wouldn't be favouring direct cultural subsidy to unmanaged content, but that perhaps it should be eligible for experimental R&D and innovation grants and so on. Does it ever get federal government innovation and R&D money? And just by the way, why wouldn't you have direct cultural subsidies?
Yeah, well, it could be a typo there, you know. I mean, I could have a question mark after no direct cultural subsidy, and I actually did have that, but then I thought it wasn't grammatical. So don't read too much into that. I'm not saying there should definitely not be any direct cultural subsidy. I think the question's open. The question is definitely open. I mean, when I was on the AFC board in the 1990s, the question of community television, why would we not look at supporting content creation on community television? And the answer was, well, if you opened up the doors of the limited subsidy pot to that, well, we'd be blown out of the water. There's so much. Well, not a good answer, in my opinion. Same thing here. You'll get the same reaction, which is, this is amateur content. Why on earth would we be, this isn't building the Australian screen industry? Well, I think we're in exactly the same space as we might have been 15, 20 years ago around community television. But it's even more apparent today because, look at the user-generated content figures that we all know about. That's where a lot of the action is, and it is where content creation capacity is being developed. So I think it's direct cultural subsidy is open, actually, in that space, but I think even just as important is around experimental R&D. And but of course, to do that, you know, you need to be engaging with enterprises. I mean, you know, Australian policy in you know, R&D and innovation policy is well, certainly R&D policy is about enterprises. It's not about individuals in garages. So you know, it's about the next stage. Experimental R&D, I think, is about the next stage. And I say it in part to stress the convergent, the portfolio convergent implications of some of this stuff. You know, that DISA should be as concerned about these questions as your department.
Any more from the audience? I might fill the void with
Whack
one
me
if
with
I
a
may.
few.
Well, there were two that struck me, but I'll do them. I won't try and bundle them all together. One, you made the point, at one point I think you described the sort of Australian content regulations as one of the central policy instruments in this space. I guess my question is really, can, will or should this continue to be the case?
Well, you know, there'll be arguments, as there always are and have been, that those who work under the regulatory burden of Australian content, you know, are being threatened by user-generated content, by you know, audiences for the broadcasters appear to be static. I mean, certainly your background paper suggests that there's been a sort of secular decline, but there are. It's not in a crisis by any means, and of course, because the advertising market has picked up very quickly after the you know, rather shallow GFC here, then the broadcasters are doing very well, and they've been helped along as well in various ways. So that argument is not. I mean, it'll be run in the convergence inquiry, but it won't hold water in my view. So certainly regulatory forbearance around Australian content. Status quo should be the assumed outcome for the incumbents. And then, of course, you've got the FTA with the US and some of the difficulties of regulation of new services. But of course, what would that look like? And more importantly, whether direct subsidies to new services would also attract the attention of the US FTA rules are probably more pertinent than a regulatory option. I would think I think that'll be one of the pressure points for sure.
Any more from the floor, or can I go to my number 2? I suppose the second thing that struck me was, do we know, or what do we know about the changing nature of consumption patterns or the approach that the audience is taking to this stuff? Because, I mean, it's all well and good to talk about vast amounts of user-generated content. The question really comes down to, so who's consuming it? What do they want to consume? Eventually leading to where's the money going to go? And I guess the advertisers always have an interesting role to play in that space. And I mean, you know, from the convergence perspective, it's both interesting in terms of what people are looking to consume, as well as where they're consuming it and how the devices, the in-home, the on the move, etc. Have you got anything to comment on that side?
It's an area that is hard to get non-contestable data on, because there's no question, as I said, that the television viewing has dipped a bit, certainly in certain age groups. There's no question about that. But it's not in some what would look like irreversible decline. It's not like readership of newspapers. I mean, you know, the so-called creative destruction in the television space, in broadcasting space, is just not nearly as apparent as it is around newspapers, beginning to be very apparent in books, and of course previously in music. consumption, therefore, looks like, and I mean your background paper talks about the growth of online consumption and a relative decline in television viewing. I think advertisers, advertising, again, as your background paper says, online advertising is growing all the time. Globally, online advertising, there's no question, rapid growth in this area, and it will continue. So there will be, pressure coming on the advertising cake for broadcasters. There's no question about that. But certainly in the time frame of this convergence review, I'd say it would be a very weak argument that could be mounted for saying that the broadcasting revenue stream is under threat.
Thank you. Now, any final questions? We're pretty much bang on time. If not, just to remind you all, as you would probably be aware, evaluation forms are on your seat, so please fill them out.
I've already filled out the bit that says, how did you like the talk? I put 5 on it, or whatever the...
That's right, and I found him a photo.
Sorry, I was doing that before you came in.
That's right, we found a photocopy of that. It's pre-populated, the form. The next talking head sessions, we've got Craig Batty, from Chief Technology Officer from Fujitsu Australia, so I just let you know about that. And finally, I could ask you all to once again thank Professor Cunningham for taking the time and coming to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.